We are reading Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad, the third chapter, titled The Supramental Godhead, where Sri Aurobindo now deals with the answer to the question which was placed in the first verse is now answered in the subsequent verses from 2 to 8. But regarding this question, Sri Aurobindo says, the eternal question has been put, which turns man's eyes away from the visible and the outward to that which is utterly within. This use of the phrase eternal question should make us pause to meditate on this. What is this eternal question? What is the question which is turning us away from the visible and outward to that which is utterly within? And eternal meaning, it is the question which is asked again and again. It is the same question which may be asked in different forms. And it is always this one question which turns the gaze inwards to that. When dwelling on the Upanishads, we must try to allow our mind to be drawn into the mold of the rishis, and their mind was different from our mind. They saw things in continuities. They saw a single statement, a single truth, a single principle everywhere, at all levels. And so when this question is asked, very simply stated in the first verse, by whom missioned falls the mind, by whom yoked moves the life breath, by whom is impelled this word, and what God set eye and ear to their workings, this question, although fourfold, is still that one question which is turning us inwards, and it applies on all levels. In our previous discussion, we dwelt on this from a deeper perspective. But the same questions could be asked also in the most superficial, exterior domain of exploration. And briefly, we will dwell on what that is like. It is in fact this question, or differently articulated fourfold questions, which also turn the gaze of the modern seeker inward. And by the modern seeker, I mean here the scientist, who also, like the yogi, seeks to know the ultimate reality. His starting point is different, his tools are different, his domain of exploration is also exterior to begin with. But as he seeks that, he is compelled to turn inwards because he discovers that the resolution of the phenomenon, the source and cause of the phenomenon, the understanding and underlying principle of the phenomenon is always behind, inside. And although these four questions are articulated in a way which is perhaps not common to the scientist's vocabulary, the questions themselves are in fact the most profound questions that modern scientists are struggling with. If we were to restate them, then we would immediately understand how. The first was, by whom missioned falls the mind shot to its mark? The modern scientists ask the question, what is this faculty or power of intelligence? How can we recreate intelligence in a computer? But in order to recreate intelligence, it must first understand what is intelligence. And observing this functioning of intelligence, we find, although we can imitate its superficial forms with rules and formulae, software simulations, there is a dimension to intelligence which somehow always slips the grasp of the scientist. Many have even attempted to claim that given a sufficiently powerful computer, we will finally be able to catch this creature called intelligence. In practice, though, the deeper we get into the study of intelligence, the more we find it is layered. And the true power of the intelligence is hidden behind its phenomenal expression. In fact, it is inevitably this conclusion that the researcher comes to, that intelligence requires something behind which knows and which can modify the frontal form. But that something behind itself is guided by or knows by something greater than itself. And suddenly you end up with this infinite recursion. So, in terms of the vocabulary of the scientist of artificial intelligence, there is a, if this is the brain where the functioning of intelligence takes place, there must be behind it a B brain, and behind the B brain's intelligence, a C brain, and behind that, a D brain, infinitely behind it, something which makes this capable of standing back from itself, correcting itself, and redirecting its focus. How long will you go on? Infinitely? Doesn't make sense because we don't have enough neurons in our brain. And so, inevitably, the conclusion is true intelligence is not a product of the brain. But still, what is it? And we have not answered the question. If you pursue this thought process to its culmination, you come to a very simple conclusion, and that is that which is the true intelligence of our intelligence must obviously be itself that which it is expressing. It is not a function. It is itself intelligence. It is itself knowledge. It doesn't have knowledge. Our mind has knowledge. Our brain has information or knowledge. A formula has data on which it operates. But that which is at the back of it all essential is knowledge. Doesn't have, it is. It cannot be formula. It is formula and data merged into each other, and we do not have a term for that. A thing which exists, therefore, by itself, which can act upon external data, but then it can act upon external data because the external data is already a part of it. And this is the brilliant insight. Not only it is knowledge, but all the things of it is it has knowledge are themselves part of it. Therefore, it knows them. Therefore, it can deal with them. And so, instead of a series of recursions, we come to something grand that stands back, which is everything, which is the absolute, which is the source, the cause, the thing itself. It, therefore, is the thinker, the intelligence within the mind's working. And when you come to such a conclusion, the scientist, of course, is flabbergasted because it goes beyond the domain of his exploration. The yogi immediately catches this and pursues it by an effort of inner identity. But you see, the question itself is a very relevant question to the most external quest of science. The second question, by whom yoked moves the first life breath forward on its path? And science asks this question with a different vocabulary when it asks, what is life? And the problem with this term life is that we don't even know how to describe it or to define it. So, arbitrarily, a certain group of scientists have described certain functions of life. Life reproduces itself, life acts upon the world, life preserves itself, and so on. But the deeper question, which is not asked, why? Why does life reproduce itself? Why does it preserve itself? Why does it act on circumstances? Or even more profoundly, how does it reproduce itself? How does it preserve itself, even heal itself? In the very act of healing itself, it must know itself entirely. It must know what it can be in order to be able to organize its movement back to what it should be. When it is damaged, it should know what it is to be healthy and so is able to bring itself back to health. When it reproduces itself, it must make a replica of all that it is with whatever change or variation. And so it must know itself entirely. And we come back to the same kind of thinking which we did with intelligence. Is essentially true life is itself life. It is not a function, it is not a pattern of behavior, it is not a certain activity, it is. And then it can express itself in activities, in forms and media. And this is the reason why, when in fact science explores the nature of life, it comes to those strange borderlines where we see things which are at the same time crystalline, which are at the same time living, and we do not know where to draw the line of life. Sri Aurobindo refers to the pioneering work of the scientist Jagadish Chandra Bose 100 years ago. Pioneering then, and to this day, his work remains pioneering. It has never been replicated by anybody or superseded by anybody. It stands by itself as an extraordinary attainment where he showed that the same life processes in the muscle are replicated in the plant tissue and are exactly the same life processes in the metal. And placing the three graphs next to each other, he asked the scientists to show which is living and which is dead, and you couldn't see the difference. The same growth process in the crystal is repeated, replicated in the growth of the plant and in the growth of the tissue. The same process of wearing out, breaking down, and rejoining, healing, is replicated in all three. And therefore, the conclusion he came to was the life in all three is one. Life is not the object, it's not the machinery, it's not the medium in which it expresses. It is itself pure life force. And so, this second question also is a quest of science, how far science is willing to accept a reality which is non material limits science's breakthrough. But increasingly, scientists are compelled to accept there is something else. The third question, by whom impelled is this word that men speak? If we are to re articulate it in the vocabulary of science, we will say, we would ask, what is true creativity? And in trying to define creativity, we find we are unable to. We can imitate somebody's creativity, but the imitation is obviously that an imitation. It continues to repeat itself eventually. True creativity brings into expression something which was not before. And how is one to do that? Something which, in fact, in seeing it, you know it does not belong to this world. A beautiful painting has this character of a timeless feel. You can try to make a replica of it, but the replica as if loses something. If you try to teach an artist, here you be creative like Leonardo da Vinci, well, he will look at Leonardo da Vinci's and make variations of his paintings or sculptures, but it will not be creativity. There is something else that is being done in the act of creativity, which is not describable in terms of formulas, in terms of forms, in terms of systems and structures. And so this is a practical problem because we cannot define it, we cannot teach a computer to become creative truly. We can only teach it to make combinations of existing patterns. And so this third question also points inwards to a source which is beyond our phenomenal world. And finally, the fourth question, what God set eye and ear to their workings? This is, it could be re-articulated in terms of science, in terms of artificial intelligence, with the question, what is perception? I see this plant, but in my eyes, it is only a pattern of dots. So many cells which had rays of light gave off signals which went to the brain, which got processed in so many cells. It's all pieces joined together. You look at a television screen, you have so many dots by so many dots, a picture. What is the picture made of? Dots of brightness, light. If you come close enough, you see only points of light. You do not see the plant. You move back enough, and suddenly the points of light seem to merge, and you see not a collection of points, but a thing in itself. How did we perceive the thing? How did we recognize the thing? What is this experience of recognition of an object, of seeing inside the sight? And in the field of artificial intelligence, this is called the hard problem. It is hard because it is not easy to resolve. It has not been solved to this day. It compels you to accept there is something else behind which is actually seeing. The experience of seeing is a thing in itself. So we see how these four facets of the question, Kena, is in fact an eternal question. It may take many number of forms in many different fields of exploration at different times of the human journey, but it is always in different words the same essential question, Kena, by whom? Science uses the word by what or how. The Kena Upanishad says by whom. And the difference is in the paradigm of approach. To the Upanishad, this entire reality is one conscious being. To science, this whole universe is a gigantic machine, or at least that's how it starts with. And so the science will not say who, it will ask what and how. But eventually, as we proceed along these lines of inquiry, we come to the recognition of something which is innate all knowledge, which is the seeing experience and the knowing experience, which is itself life, and which is the source of all creativity, of all creation, and all this phenomenon is an unfolding of its infinite potential. And at that point, we know it as consciousness, light, representing knowledge, and life. Now, these three words are what Sri Aurobindo is going to dwell upon in the paragraph that follows. And now we will appreciate it not only in its higher spiritual sense, but also in its most material sense of the problems that humanity is struggling with, even in its exploration of science. So, this question, Kena, by whom, is a compelling question. And he says, when the human soul is once seized by this compelling direction, it can no longer be satisfied with looking forth at mortalities and seemings. And that's because we have been touched by a deeper truth, and everything else now feels as if a pale shadow, not satisfying enough. It means that already in the very fact of our turning within by the question, somewhere within us we have touched it. And because we have touched it, we know that there is a deeper satisfaction possible. And so now these things of the world do not satisfy anymore. And the soul, the human soul, is driven to gaze inward into a new world of realities. Always, when in life you find yourself dissatisfied, know that this is dissatisfying in relation to something else which is more satisfying. And if I ask at that point, what is that other thing? I say, I don't know. But I know that there is something else more satisfying, therefore now this no more satisfies me. And how do I know there is something else more satisfying? Because in our own higher parts, subliminal or superconscient, we have touched that. Or rather, more accurately, that has touched us. So in the yogic tradition, we say, when the divine thinks of us, then we remember him. And this is the deeper truth of it, that when that deeper reality, which is always there anyway, when it puts out, when it reaches out and touches the surface person, personality and person, the touch itself awakens in us something, a longing, a yearning, as if something forgotten which you do not remember. But you know that there was something which you do not remember. You know that it was more satisfying. Where is it? Where was it? We do not know. But we know that it will be because it can be, because it is already somewhere. So the human soul, once seized, that's why he uses the word seized by this compelling direction, can no longer be satisfied with looking forth at mortalities and seemings through those doors of the mind and sense. But still, we face one problem, and this is in the second paragraph. Sri Aurobindo deals with this question. Here in this world, we possess something which we value. And although we are pulled to seek that, since we do not know it yet, at least consciously, we are unable to let go of what we have because, at least, however partial, this does partially satisfy. And so, this has to be abandoned to get to that. If it has to be abandoned, then that must be far more powerful as an attraction. And what is that? What is it that's being offered? And that Sri Aurobindo says, a secret offer of something so great as to be a full reward for all possible renunciation that can be demanded of him here. And what is offered? Not an enlarged becoming, but an infinite being. Not always relative piecings of knowledge, but the possession of our essential consciousness. Not partial satisfactions, but deep delight. In a word, immortality. We read these last time, and now we continue with the next paragraph. Sri Aurobindo now puts that in relation to this, and this in relation to that. What is their relationship? What is their right role in relation to each other? And this, in fact, is what the verses 2 to 8 are dwelling upon when they answer the question which is placed in the first verse. So, having read those verses already last time, we see Sri Aurobindo's commentary. He says, the language of the Upanishad makes it strikingly clear that it is no metaphysical abstraction, no void silence, no indeterminate absolute that is offered to the soul that aspires, but rather the absolute of all that is possessed by it here in the relative world of its sojourning. All here in the mental is a growing light, consciousness, and life. All there in the supramental is an infinite light, is an infinite life, light, and consciousness. That which here is here shadowed is there found. The incomplete here is there fulfilled. So first correction which is made here in Sri Aurobindo's commentary is that It is not a metaphysical abstraction, something which belongs to the domain of abstract thinking. Some ideal, some utopia which can never become practical, which does not even belong to this world. It's not an abstraction. Second, it's not a silence, an emptiness. Often in the turning away from the limitations of the world, the soul says, I have enough of this chasing of illusions, and now I want to dissolve it all and rest in some blankness. But what is offered here is not blankness, nor even an absolute, capital A, an absolute which is indeterminate. See, the problem with the absolute, capital A, from the experience of the world, it cannot be described. There is nothing in our vocabulary that can express it. How then are you to enjoy it? The only way you can truly enjoy it is if you withdraw into the absolute and merge into it, at which point you have nothing to do with the relativities. And so it still is an absorption into something which is indeterminate. And none of it gives us even the partial satisfaction which I have in the play of the appearances, mortalities, and seemings and forms. Here at least I have a satisfaction. There will I have a satisfaction. Perhaps when I get to it, I might say it is worthwhile, but before I get to it, it is an abstraction. So he says, none of these abstractions or silences or indeterminates are offered. What is offered is the absolute of all that is possessed by it here in the relative world of its sojournings. All things here which are in the relativity can become better and better and better. But when you keep on making them better, is there a point where we can say, now they have reached their highest possibility? That would be its absolute. So I want to be happy. But when I was happy as a child, that is an inferior happiness to the happiness I can have as an adult, where my awareness and my experience of the world is so much more rich. But I want to be happier. I am dissatisfied with my happiness. Is there such a thing as a happiness that will be complete and that I can say, yes, I am satisfied and I am not bored? The nature of the human happiness is the moment you come to a level of plateau that says, here I have reached happiness, very quickly, after a while, that plateau becomes boring. And now you're unhappy with the limitation of that happiness. Is there such a thing which is a happiness which is complete and is not a plateau, which is not going to lead to a sense of limitation again? An absolute happiness. Similarly, is there a consciousness that can grow and grow and grow and awaken into completeness and say, yes, this is absolute, this is complete, and yet does not stop? There is still the experience of growth and the enjoyment and the delight or surprise. And the same with knowledge, light. So, the absolute of all that is possessed by it here, in other words, all that I am experiencing in this life, which is partially satisfying, can be taken into its culmination in an absolute, which would still be therefore part of life. All here in the mental is a growing light, consciousness, and life. All there in the supramental is an infinite life, light, and consciousness. So we, in that domain, in that source, in that thing of which the question is pointing us to, it is there in infinity. But the infinity again is not a flat infinity, it is unendingly rich in its possibilities of exploration. But here what we have in the relative, it says in the relative world of its sojourning. And the word is reminds us of something important. We are here temporarily, sojourning, resting, traveling, temporarily. In other words, we did not come into this relative world from a relativity. We came to it from something which was not a relativity, which was itself that absolute. From here, when we go back, we also go back to that absolute. And therefore, this sense, the sense of authority, rulership, king. But there is also a secondary sense which is supreme, preeminent, indisputable, having rank, power, or authority, greatest in degree, utmost, or extreme. Even other variations to the meaning include efficacious, potent. So you see here, there is an absolute, which is the sense of the sovereign. But at the same time, the relationship is this: that absolute is king, is the authority, is the source of the power, of the knowledge, of the delight, of the consciousness, of the life that is here. So that is sovereign mind of this mind, not only its absolute, its power, its source, but it is itself the Lord of this mind. In other words, it is there that the true functioning of this mind is worked out. This only is a reflection of its working. When, for example, in life we have a problem, we sit down and think about the problem, and then suddenly we come to an insight, an idea, or a solution, and we say, I have got this. I know the solution. What happened within our mind by which the solution was found? In a computer, every possible solution would be matched against the problem to see how they connect. We are not doing that. We are allowing our mind to drift, and then suddenly the solution comes. We chance upon it as if. But what brought the drift to that solution? What brought the solution into the mind's general wandering? Behind our mind, something takes place where the knowledge is already there, and our wandering, our questing informs the true mind behind. This is what I seek. And the true knower then puts out what is to be known, and then it pops into our mind, and we chance upon it and we say, ah, I've got it. This is the way it truly happens within us. And that's why we are able to catch it most easily when we are able to make our mind quiet and turn upwards to that source where already the knowledge is held. Sri Aurobindo gives this example, I think, in the Life Divine, where he says that in those very common occurrences where we have a question that's bothering, we don't have an answer, we go to sleep and then we wake up and we have the answer. He says what happens is the true knower within, he is informed when we start troubling ourselves with the questing. But then when we are asleep, that's when he gets a chance to put that knowledge, to put that insight into the surface consciousness. So if you had to now turn this into a system, how am I to get knowledge from my inner source? The method would be this. First, you have to inform that inner source that you're seeking this knowledge. This automatically happens when we struggle to gain it. But we could do it also consciously by turning our awareness inwards or upwards to the subliminal or the superconscient and asking. We can formulate a question or turn in aspiration, seeking, calling. And then we have to become very quiet so that when the response comes, we can receive it as purely, as clearly, and as completely as possible. And then it comes. Sometimes we have to wait. Sometimes even we have to wait a few days because there is a gap and there is a time that it takes for the impulse to journey in between. Of course, as we grow in our familiarity with the inner and the higher, we can simply turn in and discover. It was already there. We uncover, remove the layer in between, discover and receive, draw out and express. But the idea is that there is already that knowledge and there is a conscious knower who can give it to us. This is what happens when we are studying to learn something new, to develop a new skill, whether it is to play an instrument or we are reading a book which involves difficult ideas which somehow the mind is incapable of absorbing. We go to sleep, and the next day, when we attempt the same thing, suddenly our fingers are flowing easily on the instrument. Suddenly, while reading, we understand easily. What happened is during the time of the sleep, the true knower imprinted our mind, imprinted our life energies and our senses, even the nervous system in our fingers, with the right habit or knowledge, the imprint of that consciousness. So again, we can recognize the importance of this period of rest and assimilation and receptivity in any kind of new learning, because all new learning is nothing but a drawing out of what is already known deep within. So it is sovereign mind of this mind. Again, the next phrase, secret life of this life. And now it's much easier for us, having dwelt on the relationship of the mind, to understand the relationship of life. In our life that we experience is a life force, prana, working, driving life processes, energizing our activities of mind, emotions, will, body. But behind it is the true source of the impulse of life, the direction of life, and even of interest. When on the surface life, I am compelled by others to forcibly pursue a direction contrary to the inner life, I begin to feel it as suffocating. If somebody tells you that for the next 1 year, you must take up this thing and study this alone and do nothing else, and it so happens that is one of your perhaps least interesting of topics, you could do it for a while, but eventually you will start suffocating. But what is this feeling of suffocation? If you observe the nature of the suffocation, something inside is pushing outwards, wanting to break the shackles, to break the prison. The suffocation is a sense of constriction, or rather a sense of pushing out from within, which wants to expand against the constriction. And where did that come from? What chooses that in me this is not satisfying, there is something else which is more satisfying? And I'm sure I could find another person on earth who would find this so satisfying and that unsatisfying. What chooses in us that this is satisfying and not that, or even changes across the years? We will find in the human mental and emotional and biological processes certain cycles. At a certain age, suddenly certain hormones kick in and the body starts growing. All right, we will say, in the cells there is a timer which somehow does it. But which cell? And if there are a million cells, how do you synchronize all those clocks? And how do you ensure that they don't go in different times? Or they kick in several times because they're out of sync? The thing that kicks in is not a single cell, it is an inhabiting consciousness which works through all the cells at the same time. So all these cells suddenly wake up and begin to act in a certain way. In nature, we see this phenomena quite often. There is a particular day in the whole year. On that full moon day, and exactly on that full moon day, when the moon is aligned to a particular constellation, star, suddenly all the tiny creatures of the, what is that, in the ocean, those rock-like structures which are housing. So all these little creatures which are otherwise sleeping inside or living inside their inhabitation, they come out, they surge out into the sea, and together they come up, they mate, and then they go back. Exactly on that particular day of the full moon once in the year. Now, how do those creatures deep inside the water know that it is the full moon? And of that particular alignment of the moon with that particular star, we don't have an example, an answer. And it cannot be explained purely by biological timing clocks inside cells. It has to be a movement of life force inhabiting all these different creatures, which wakes up and says, now, and suddenly they start moving. And the same happens in our biology now, and suddenly all the hormones kick in, all the cells start growing in a certain way, but always harmoniously. Briefly, during the process when we are suddenly growing up in teenage, it may feel as if certain parts are growing faster than others, but still there is an overall harmony maintained. And then suddenly the signal goes out and it stops. Similarly, we have at other ages psychological shifts. They say in the mid 30s often there's a shift. There's another shift that takes place in what is called midlife crisis, and so on. There are shifts in the mind where suddenly you say, I've done all this, I've struggled all my life, now enough. Now I need to do something more meaningful. Where did that shift come from? In the mind. So we see in all the functions, at all levels of life, there are these sudden changes, and when they happen everywhere at the same time within us. That is truly the secret life of this life. Secret because we don't know it. It still guides, it still leads and decides. So this beyond is not an annihilation, but a transfiguration of all that we are here. It is also sovereign mind of this mind. It is secret life, capital L, of this life, lowercase l. And finally, it is the absolute sense, capital S, which supports and justifies our limited senses. So it has two roles. It supports and it justifies. Now we see first how it supports. Our senses are in fact extremely narrow. What do we see? Now, because of the tools of science, we are able to actually map out. There's a very narrow band of frequencies of light where we see anything more rapid in frequency or lower in frequency, we cannot see. Could we have seen? Oh yes, because we know of animals who can. The same with our hearing. In our own human life, as children, we hear a much wider range as we measure it from, we can hear sometimes from even 12 hertz to 28, 30, sometimes even higher kilohertz. They say the average is 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, but little children can take much wider range. Even the ultrasonic scan which is done on the fetus is of a very high frequency, so high that the adult cannot hear, but it damages the fetus because the fetus is sensitive to it. And so, as we grow older, somehow that range narrows. The ranges which are accessible to the little child have become dulled in the adult. Although the dog in the adult stage still hears it, even when his range is dulled. So in a principle, we are capable of a much wider range. We just happen to have it dulled because of a loss of capacity. Why couldn't we hear much more perhaps? Why can't we see in the infrared, in the ultraviolet? Why can't we see in X-rays, in millimeter waves? Why can't we see all possible ranges of light, hear all possible ranges of sound or touch in sensitivity, all possible ranges? In fact, if you look at the whole universe as a being, the universe experiences all those ranges as a being. We are a part of that being and we experience a portion only of that range. But it is the universe who's experiencing the full range, because if it was not experiencing it, the range would not exist. Rather, it exists because the universe experiences it. And we only share a small part. So there is something which we could call an absolute sense. Because that happens, we can experience in our partial formation a partial range of it. And so that absolute sense supports our limited senses. If you look at it this way, in the ocean, you can have large waves, narrow waves, small ripples, large ripples. And if you put a little boat, the boat catches a certain range of the waves. Too small a ripple, the boat doesn't move. Too large a ripple, the boat doesn't notice. It simply rose and fell, and it didn't even notice that there was a huge wave of a kilometer in size. It's too large for it to register. But because ocean experiences it, therefore boat is capable of experiencing whatever limited range according to its limited capacity. So that true absolute sense supports our limited senses. But then Sri Aurobindo uses another word, it also justifies our limited senses. And this is something more profound. When something justifies, it is as if it makes it worthwhile. Because the absolute sense exists, this limitation of our sense becomes worthwhile. Because in the absolute sense, there is the delight of the experience, always undiluted, absolute. Here, in the limited sense, a partial play of the delight, a partial experience of the delight is possible, making this worthwhile. But it is also made worthwhile because it offers the promise that whatever our limitation today, tomorrow, or the day after, we will grow beyond it because that is already there. And we share in that. We share in its completeness. And so one day, if not now, we will have the full experience of the completeness. So the absolute sense which supports and justifies our limited senses. So we reread this, you see how profound it is. The beyond, capital B. The beyond is not an annihilation, but a transfiguration of all that we are here in our world of forms. It is sovereign mind of this mind, secret life of this life, the absolute sense which supports and justifies our limited senses. And that time we are seeing, at this point we're seeing a mind capital M, a life capital S, a sense capital L, a sense capital S, of which we are a frontal, reflected, limited mind, life, and sense. And you see now the relationship is complete. The beyond is not an annihilation, it is a transfiguration of all that we are here in our world of forms. Once this relationship is set, Sri Aurobindo moves to the next. How do we now experience or participate in that? We renounce ourselves in order to find ourselves. For in the mental life, there is only a seeking, but never an ultimate finding, till mind is overpassed. Therefore, there is behind all our mentality a perfection of ourselves which appears to us as an antinomy and contrast to what we are. For here, we are a constant becoming. There we possess our eternal being. Here we conceive of ourselves as a changeful consciousness developed and always developing by hampered effort in the drive of time. There we are an immutable consciousness, and so on. But the relationship is this. We are that. We are this. So this also is ourselves, that also is ourselves. But in order to become or find ourselves there, we have to renounce ourselves here. Why? Why is this renunciation necessary? Why can't we say, I will just think harder, I will just feel more, I will just struggle more, and eventually I will get to that? And this explanation is very important. It goes at the very core of the whole spiritual effort. It says, for in the mental life there is only a seeking, but never an ultimate finding, till mind is overpassed. So in this limited consciousness, the nature of the effort is this seeking unendingly. Whereas there, you are. Therefore, by seeking, you don't get to somewhere where you are. You only get to a greater satisfaction of your seeking. But there's nothing where you can say, I am this. Because if there was in the seeking a step you could reach, having reached that step, you could say, what more? So, in the domain of seeking, you can never get to a point where you can say, I am. The domain of mind is this domain of seeking. So, he says, there is never an ultimate finding till mind is overpassed. We have very interesting analogies which are part of the domain of the mental exploration. And one of these analogies is what we call infinite series. The question that is asked is, if I move one step, let's say I move from here to there. First, I have traveled half the distance in half the time it would take me. And then, for what remains, I have traveled half that distance in half the time it would take me. And from what it remains, I have to travel first half the distance in half of that time that remains, and so on unendingly. So, for me to take this one step up to there, I will never get to it because I'm always taking another half and another half and another half and another half and another half unendingly. You have an infinite series, but where does it lead to? As long as I am in the series measuring the half steps, I will never get there. There has to be a point where I say, forget the space, forget the time, I just step. I am there. My foot is there, it's resting. It's something like that in terms of our consciousness. As long as we're in the consciousness of seeking, there is never an ultimate finding till mind is overpassed. Therefore, you see the logic. Therefore, there is behind all our mentality perfection of ourselves. Within the mentality, there is the seeking. Behind the mentality, where there is only the finding, there is the being. So he says, there, behind the mentality of perfection of ourselves, and the relationship of that perfection to this, it appears to us as an antinomy and contrast to what we are. So antinomy has a very specific sense that it is opposite, but both opposite statements are as if justified. They have their own logic, they have their own justification. So this is justified, that is justified, but they are opposites. So what does it mean? And that's antinomy. But also it's a contrast. The two are so different. One is existing in terms of the other, but the very opposite as if. Therefore, there is behind all our mentality a perfection of ourselves, which appears to us as an antinomy and contrast to what we are. And then he describes the nature of that antinomy and contrast. Here we are in becoming, there we are in eternal being, and so on, which we will take up next time. And the text we will continue after a gap of about a month. We will resume the next class from April 17th onwards. So for now, this is a very profound passage, and we will just reread this and see how it is all captured in the few verses, the first few verses of the Upanishad, and meditate on it briefly. For the continuation, maintaining the continuity of our studies, we will show some videos of earlier classes or other lectures for those who are interested at the same time in the days in between. So this is offered, not an enlarged becoming, but infinite being, not always relative piecings of knowledge, but the possession of our essential consciousness, not partial satisfactions, but the delight. In a word, immortality. The language of the Upanishad makes it strikingly clear that it is no metaphysical abstraction, no void silence, no indeterminate absolute which is offered to the soul that aspires, but rather the absolute of all that is possessed by it here in the relative world of its sojourning. All here in the mental is a growing light, consciousness, and life. All there in the supramental is an infinite life, light, and consciousness. That which is here shadowed is there found. The incomplete here is there the fulfilled. The beyond is not an annihilation, but a transfiguration of all that we are here in our world of forms. It is sovereign mind of this mind, secret life of this life, the absolute sense which supports and justifies our limited senses. We renounce ourselves in order to find ourselves. For in the mental life there is only a seeking, but never an ultimate finding, till mind is overpast. Therefore, there is behind all our mentality a perfection of ourselves which appears to us as an antinomy and contrast to what we are.